Welcome to The Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you with us. Omar Shakir is about to be deported from Israel, where he works as director of Human Rights Watch for Israel and Palestine. Israel accuses Human Rights Watch of supporting the boycott and divestment movement. They don't. Omar Shakir, some people who read, said that he is a part of BDS demonstrations in college. That was a while back, and not now anyway, in his job with Human Rights Watch. Earlier this year, Omar Shakir joined us to talk about the Israeli government's attempt to kick him out of the country, as well as to discuss a Human Rights Watch report, which he co-authored, criticizing the human rights violations by both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, which shows Human Rights Watch exposes and opposes human rights violations not only in Israel, but by Palestinian authorities as well. Shakir has been waging this fight for months, and last week, the Israeli Supreme Court rejected his appeal. His visa will not be renewed, so he's being forced to leave Israel voluntarily, or he will be forcibly deported. The court's decision was severely criticized by the UN and by the European Union. Now, we're about to watch these comments from Gerald Steinberg, who is president of a non-governmental organization called NGO Monitor, which is dedicated to attacking human rights organizations and any critics of Israel as anti-Semitic. He's a close friend of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and his words, well, we might say, unofficially mimic the Israelis' right-wing political leadership. This is what he had to say about Shakir's deportation.
Freedom of speech and all those things apply to citizens of the country. It does not apply to people who are outside. There is no right, there's no automatic right. It's a privilege. When you go to a country, you take out your foreign country, you take out your passport, you sometimes apply for a visa in advance, and the country decides whether you should be or not should be allowed in. In fact, there are many, many cases, particularly after 9/11, of democratic countries that deny visas, sometimes for specific reasons, sometimes you don't know why. Sometimes it takes a long time, they do background checks. So all of this is completely within democratic norms, and the really high-pitched screaming that's going on by the entire human rights propaganda machine. And remember, they've got over $90 million a year, and their top people were here running this campaign. In fact, this is a victory for them. They're going to use this propaganda against Israel. They're going to use the same terminology that we've heard so far today: anti-democratic, excluding, preventing free speech, all of those slogans and those myths and those lies. They're going to use that. So Israel's going to have a tough time in the diplomatic and public relations arena. It may not have been a good move, in fact, to have this law and to apply it, but that's how the court ruled.
High-pitched screaming about free speech. Well, now we're joined by the activist who is about to be forced to leave Israel, Omar Shakir, the Israel and Palestine director of Human Rights Watch. Mr. Shakir has always been a human rights activist. From his work in the past, focused on U.S. counterterrorism policies, including legal representation of Guantanamo detainees, investigating human rights violations in Egypt, including the Rabaa massacre that took place, and as a Fulbright scholar co-authoring a report on the civilian deaths and trauma as a result of U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan, and joins us now on what appears to be his final days in Israel. And Omar, welcome. Good to have you back with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm just curious. Let me ask you a very quick personal question, if I might, and if you don't want to answer, that's fine. But I'm just curious about your own life at the moment, how it's been affected by this court's decision. From, I mean, you walk around Jerusalem and your face has been plastered all over the media as an enemy of the state. I mean, how has that been for you?
Look, I mean, this has been my home for the last 2.5 years, and we're asking the court, and we've been asking the government for nothing more than to allow me to stay here and do my job. And the idea that I will be forced to leave is a hard one to swallow. At the same time, what I'm facing is quite small compared to, first of all, what Israeli and Palestinian human rights defenders face, who are regularly attacked by the Israeli government and sometimes face criminal charges, travel bans, and worse, much less millions of Israelis and Palestinians who face regular human rights abuse, including the 2 million Palestinians of Gaza, who for over 12 years have been under a closure which prevents them as a rule from free travel. So it's a small cost compared to what others face, but at the same time, it shines a light into the true nature of what's happening here and the reality of a government in the 53rd year of an occupation defined by systematic rights abuse and institutional discrimination.
Not to mention people like the Filipinos and others who are being forced to leave, being separated from their families, separating children who've been born in Israel, one woman hiding her children, all that's going on. Well, this is going on as well. Who are there just to make a living and become Israelis, if they can be. So going back to your specific case, I mean, what do you think precipitated this? I mean, Human Rights Watch is like really critical of what's been going on, but if you compare it to, let's say, the work of Amnesty International, which has made open calls to put an arms embargo on Israel, or the UN Human Rights Commission, which accused Israel of unlawfully killing civilians, hundreds of civilians in Gaza, and other organizations like B'Tselem and Israel itself, all the things they've done, given the work that Human Rights Watch has done in the past, including critiquing, as we said earlier, what goes on by the Palestinian Authority and by Hamas in Gaza. So why do you think you were targeted as opposed to any of these other groups?
Look, I think it's this case should not be seen in isolation. It should be seen as part of the larger assault on human rights advocacy by the Israeli government. In fact, just last month, a staff member of Amnesty International, a Palestinian staff member, was issued a travel ban, was banned from leaving the occupied West Bank to attend a relative's funeral. You mentioned B'Tselem, which has been called a traitor, traitors by the Israeli government. The reality here is it's not only part of an attack on human rights defenders, it's part of a sustained push to use the slogan of fighting boycotts as a way to stymie legitimate human rights advocacy. In 2011, Israel passed an anti-boycott law that imposed a civil cause of action for those who call for boycotts. Then in 2017, they issued the law that's been used to deny entry. Now they're deporting somebody with legal status. At the same time, the Interior Ministry has opened an investigation into the BDS co-founder Omar Shakir's permanent residency status here. So again, when you see it as part of the larger context, not only the attacks on human rights defenders, but the increasing impunity that Israel carries out in its daily systematic rights abuse against Palestinians. It's lost even the pretext of respect for basic international norms.
But I mean, coming back to that, I mean, when you look at the decision that was made, I mean, the government really pushed the idea of having you deported. When the court agreed, some of the people in government started blaming the court that makes Israel look bad, but they're still going through with your deportation. But again, let me just come back to the point of why do you think you were targeted? I mean, other people inside of Israel, in international organizations, have made much more vociferous and pointed condemnations of Israel itself. But Human Rights Watch had the spotlight shone on them instead of the other groups. Why do you think that is?
Look, I think it's purely a product of when things happen, right? I mean, I applied for a work permit. My work permit, the proceedings against it began shortly after this law was issued. And the reality is other steps and other mechanisms have been taken against others. The reality when you look at 52 years of Israeli occupation policies is oftentimes the idea here is to take actions that induce a larger effect, right? So look at revocation of residency for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, 15,000 cases, a lot, each of which is a serious violation of international law. But at the same time, the purpose is much larger because it imposes on the 300,000+ Palestinians of East Jerusalem a fear that their status could be lost by merely traveling abroad or moving locations. So the reality is Israel will oftentimes take a case or two, and the context of which can be a product of many different factors, but use it as a way to achieve a larger policy objective.
I mean, and then this is an internal question to Israel, of course, but I mean, when you see that the former Minister of Justice, Omar Shakir, accused the Supreme Court of supporting human rights too much, and the present Minister of Justice, Amir Ohana, has this constant onslaught against the judicial system. I mean, many people are just kind of pondering whether or not this whole decision by this judiciary was really politically pushed and kind of terrified to stand up against the Israeli government themselves. I mean, because so many people have stood up against your deportation, and it just makes so little sense to many people watching from the outside.
Look, the reality is the Israeli Supreme Court has always rubber-stamped Israel's violations, such as settlements, that are core characteristics of its 52-year-long occupation. While the track record has been a bit more positive when it comes in comparison to free expression, the reality here is the court has put its rubber stamp now on the Netanyahu government's campaign to muzzle legitimate human rights advocacy. And as you've said, the work Human Rights Watch does is by no means means, outside of the mainstream course of international advocacy, the entire world outside of the Israeli government and, maybe the United States today, parts of this administration consider settlements illegal. And all Human Rights Watch has done is to call for businesses to refrain from engaging in that illegality. So I think it's important to see this decision, amid changes in the Supreme Court, especially ones that have taken place over the last 10 years, but the reality of the Supreme Court's role over many years in legitimizing and indeed rubber stamping seriously problematic policies.
And you kind of question, well, how far can this go? I mean, looking at how the rest of the world looks at this, even places that were absolutely sympathetic to Israel and the state of Israel and the history of Israel itself. But, when these Jordanian citizens were arrested for coming across the border for no apparent real reason, Khalil Jarrar, who is a leading Palestinian parliamentarian, was jailed for 8 months and just released 2 weeks ago, but for no apparent reason, never really charged with anything, clearly. And you have these mass deportations of entire families of guest workers taking place. And so, I mean, you can see a pattern here. The question is, do you think this is just some major shift happening? We're kind of very much stricter, kind of narrow right-wing ideology taking over, as some people would argue. I mean, I'm just trying to, for our viewers, kind of get to the sense of why this is happening now.
I think the reality is the Israeli government feels emboldened. It feels emboldened because there have been no serious consequences for decades of illegal policies that violate human rights. And so it has successfully, in its mind, avoided international pressure, and it's now going after the voices that continue to document and advocate for changing those policies. What's needed here, again, is real concerted international action, not only to, stop my deportation and safeguard what remains of the space for independent civil society groups, but really to get to the underlying issues. There needs to be accountability through the International Criminal Court. There needs to be international action when it comes to business and settlements, including, for example, through the UN publishing a database of businesses that operate in settlements. The answer here to address the emboldening of the Israeli government to continue not only committing rights abuse but shutting down space is to counteract that by concerted international action. And
I said all can get complicated about what happened just earlier today. This is Secretary of State Pompeo talking about the settlements and some new policies by the United States.
The Trump administration is reversing the Obama administration's approach towards Israeli settlements. The establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not, per se, inconsistent with international law. Therefore, the United States government is expressing no view on the legal status of any individual settlement. Finally, calling the establishment of civilian settlements inconsistent with international law hasn't worked. This is a complex political problem that can only be solved by negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
When you hear comments like that from the United States government, it can only make matters more intense and worse, it seems to me.
Look, the U.S. position changes nothing. Pompeo, Trump, they can't erase decades of established international law that settlements are a war crime by fiat. The reality is here, the United States is continuing its policy supported by the Israeli government to, erase the green line, to make settlements a part of Israel, which no country in the world accepts. And I think you need to see these decisions in conjunction. I mean, the ruling by the Supreme Court was quite clear that, challenging Israeli policy vis-a-vis settlements in the West Bank is an attack on the legitimacy of the state. And I think it should expose to people the way in which these attacks disingenuously try to stymie legitimate advocacy rooted in significant, reams of years of international law.
So just to conclude, so what's next for Omar Shakir and Human Rights Watch in Israel-Palestine? What happens next?
Let me be crystal clear. We will continue to document rights abuses and advocate for human rights protections in Israel-Palestine. I'll continue to do that job. The reality here is if Israel does follow through with this deportation, it will join the ranks of countries like North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, that have blocked access to Human Rights Watch staff. But we will not let any government, the Israeli government included, dictate who covers those abuses or what issues we work on. We will cover the same issues with the same intensity, the same methodologies as we've always done. And we will be as committed as ever to the human rights of all people here. That won't change. And this decision really reflects more on the Israeli government and should, ring alarm bells to folks that aren't already eyes wide open about the nature of a regime systematically violating rights and doing so without even the pretext of legality.
Well, Omar Shakir, it's a pleasure to talk to you once again. Sorry for what you're going through, and we look forward to staying in touch as you continue your work in the next location, and good to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And I'm Mark Steiner here for the Real News Network. Thank you all for joining us. Let us know what you think. Take care.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.